Welcome in, welcome in. We're here again. We're here at the spot. Look at that. Look at this nice colors. We got the energetic field, electromagnetic energy behind me, within us. We're here again. I want to get started again. I'm going one more time. We're gonna hear something a little different, but staying on that same mindset. Just I want you to know how real this is. Prepare spiritually, mentally, financially. Just be ready, and especially deep dive on yourself. Really do the work on yourself. Definitely, there's some things happening, even as this is all happening, there's some spiritual depthness happening within many of us that we're feeling a change, a different change besides that which is trying to penetrate without us, fear, because this is all getting out. I mean, they're sneaky, but not. Definitely, let's get in. So I'm going to share right away because it's a long video. I cannot play this. This video is like about an hour and 20 minutes. I could 23 minutes. I'm not going to do this all. I may do it. We'll do some of it in an increment, maybe the rest. But we're going to go into this, and maybe if we meant to share the whole thing in 2 shows or 3, we'll do it. Now let me share. This one's a cool one. It says Trump is a deal maker. This is from Whitney Webb. Of course, it's going to go a little bit again on, as we know who he is, but let's make this bigger. Let me get this part out. You guys probably don't see it. I do. Let's get started. Let's don't.
Actually trying to help the everyday person in the way that he presented himself while he was campaigning.
Yeah, so as far as my perspective on Trump goes, it tends to do with the view, it tends to revolve around the view that he is a businessman at heart, and that the focus of his political style, I guess, is deal making. And, I wrote a lot in my book about Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, who was, among other things, the general counsel to McCarthy during the McCarthy hearings. He was also, a New York City lawyer that represented a lot of unsavory figures, including some tied to organized crime, and also had the ear of Ronald Reagan and top politicians in the United States, and sort of bridged a variety of worlds. And he very much essentially taught Trump the art of the deal, as it were. And, a lot of his Cohn's close associates, like the Pope family, for example, were very politically connected, also connected to organized crime, arguably. But were very much in the business of making backroom deals, and that's how, political power in the United States functions. And so, fundamentally, I think a lot of what Trump likes to focus on and promote about his political style is around negotiations, whether those are diplomatic negotiations or negotiations with businessmen that lead to big number investments he can tout to the public, which is, I think, part of the impetus behind his having the Project Stargate press conference, at the White House on his first full day, at his second term.
We did a video on
and
that.
I think that's also kind of consistent with what we saw from Trump during his first term as well. So when you're sort of focused on those metrics, I don't necessarily think that the focus is necessarily on how do I help everyday Joe. I'm sure that, in his mind, I don't really necessarily want to speak for him, but if you're, of the opinion that I'm going to tout this big multi-million-dollar investment in U.S. AI infrastructure, for example, perhaps he views that as helpful for the American economy and thus helpful for the American people. And I think it is very likely that over the next 4 years, there certainly will be some Americans that economically benefit, from Trump's economic policy. But I don't necessarily think that's going to be everybody. And I think, generally, based on what we've seen so far, there's been a lot of courting of big tech executives and a lot of talk about making the U.S. the AI and crypto capital of the world. And how much of that is necessarily going to translate or trickle down to sort of refer to Reaganite economic terms, to the everyday American public, it's really hard to know. But again, I just want to go back to someone like Eric Schmidt, for example, who, as I noted earlier, had sort of an outsized role in developing the AI policy of the military and intelligence community. He wrote a book called The Age of AI with Henry Kissinger, and also, I believe, a professor from MIT, who, I'm sorry, his name escapes me at the moment, but basically, that book posited that essentially AI is going to make a two-tiered society. There's going to be the top tier of people who develop and maintain AI and set and determine what its objective functions are, and then sort of a second class who, which we would assume is larger than the first class, so they don't explicitly say that, but who AI acts upon, and eventually that group will lose the ability to understand and really be able to conceive of how AI is impacting their lives, and will develop some sort of dependency on AI for things like decision making, sort of leading to this phenomena that they refer to in the book as cognitive diminishment, which I sort of see as this idea of, we've all heard it before, if you don't use it, you lose it. Sort of the idea of like mental math, you start using a calculator or a phone calculator or something like that, and it becomes more difficult over time, and eventually very difficult to be able to do mental math in your head, when perhaps when you were in grade school it was much easier to do that because you had to use that ability regularly. And so they essentially argue that by not making those decisions and outsourcing that to AI, this particular class will lose the ability to make those decisions over time. And when you also factor in that there's a lot of effort to sort of outsource creativity, art and music, to artificial intelligence, will that have an impact on people's ability to create, and what sort of impact will this have on society? And, these are things that I think sort of get left out of the public discussion, and I don't think they're really on someone like Trump's radar as a businessman. He's focused on sort of the bottom line, the number, the success of the negotiation, and how successful it looks, frankly, whether it's to his base or to businessmen he wants to court, or, other people, foreign leaders, and, I'll stop there, I guess.
No, that was great. So how do you feel when you hear about AI creating this two-tier system?
Oh, I certainly don't think that's positive. I think it's sort of the technocratic model that we discussed earlier, where you sort of have an elite class that sort of set, the system that will micromanage the masses at the end of the day. I mean, they don't explicitly say that in the book, but if you're familiar with someone like Henry Kissinger, for example, and some of his more controversial views on the masses and the public, and some of his more infamous quotes, is that a system that he wants to happen? I don't really know. He's dead, and so no one can ask him. But I think it is kind of disturbing, in a sense, that someone that was known. What are some of his more infamous quotes? I'm not super familiar with Kissinger. I know who he is, but I couldn't quote him.
Excuse me, Razor Bird.
Security.
Shave money.
Well, he created a national security memorandum, for example, that viewed people that live in the third world birth rates and in the global south as national security threats to the United States, and wanted to implement policies to reduce their population size, for example, and sort of had what I would argue is a eugenicist bent to some of his policies.
I got to go in on this guy. I read a book called Don't Dare Call It Conspiracy about this guy. She's talking about Kissinger. Definitely had a thing for little ones too. Yeah. I'm just gonna say, you know how you get an apple and it's not good and it has worms in it, it's rotten to the core? I'll leave it at that. To the core.
And he was one of the mentors, of course, to people that have become infamous in recent years, like the World Economic Forum chairman Klaus Schwab, some of his more infamous quotes that he's known for refer to, soldiers being, pawns of foreign policy, essentially sort of like, people's lives are just, pawns on a chessboard for the sort of the elite figures to move around, for their benefit. That's sort of the mentality as I see it of someone like him. But obviously he's been, praised as a model statesman and all of this stuff, and his mentored Trump in his first administration, mentored Hillary Clinton, people on both sides of the aisle.
No wonder she's rotten.
But I personally, I think the more you look into someone like that and his connections with sort of dubious oligarchs like David Rockefeller going, significantly back in time, he's sort of someone that promotes this idea of a global technocracy.
Okay, so do you have the impulse to want to see
One
AI
world
slow
government.
down or stop?
Well, I don't necessarily want to say that I'm like a Luddite and we should all go back to the Stone Age or things like this, but I think there needs to be like an actual public discussion on this, particularly on the fact that our out of control national security state in Silicon Valley have essentially been fusing over the past few decades, and what necessarily that means.
All the nerds.
Because a lot of people will say stuff, well, it's AI in the private sector, but when that private sector company has multi-million-dollar conflicts of interest with the national security state, I think that should
Our tax
be part
money.
of the discussion. Necessarily. And I think also there needs to be a way to sort of know whether some of these algorithms are hyped or whether what the company says their accuracy is, for example, is actually accurate before decisions are made to outsource major decision making, whether at the government level or the local level or really on any level, to an algorithm. So, as an example, during COVID-19, the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, sort of gave a green light to this Israeli company called Diagnostic Robotics to use, the health data in the state to predict COVID-19 outbreaks before they could happen, right? And Gina Raimondo, by the way,
violate HIPAA laws?
Well, I'm sure a lot of those were sort of suspended under the emergency justification of COVID-19, but I'm not exactly familiar with the legal or potential legal snafus of that at the time, or maybe they justified it by saying they sort of took anonymized the data. I don't really know, but the idea was to sort of use that data to identify local hotspots and predict outbreaks before they happen. And so obviously, if the algorithm of this company predicts an outbreak, there would be sort of these localized lockdowns, and people would lose their ability to engage in in-person commerce and freedom of movement, et cetera. So, consequences that are pretty significant to the people living there. And when I reported on at the time, as I recall, but it's been a few years, but I do know that the algorithm per the company was under 80% accurate. I think it was somewhere in the 70s. And so that's the company, right? So if it's not independently vetted, this is sort of, company PR at the end of the day, is that overinflated? It's quite possible, right? And so what if the accuracy of that isn't really in the 70s, it's in the 60s or in the 50s? It's no better than a coin toss. Right? Is it really worth putting that kind of power in the hand of an algorithm that isn't necessarily going to be more efficient and accurate, but all this hype that's been generated around AI as an industry suggests that has sort of created this public perception that AI is inherently smarter than human decision makers and more efficient and more cost effective, for example. I think these are kind of problematic scenarios that need to be considered. I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer or poo-poo on innovation, but I think, civil liberties do matter, and I think people need to be very mindful of that, especially considering, again, the Silicon Valley fusion with the national security state and the national security state's tendency to opportunistically whittle down American civil liberties for their benefit.
Yep.
It's a really interesting intersection that I clearly need to start thinking more about. The way that I would look at that, and this ties into something you mentioned earlier, during the inauguration of Donald Trump, you had all these tech billionaires there by him, and it certainly gave me like, ooh, this is why people are paranoid about oligarchy vibe.
And what he's talking about is on the side during our inauguration, we've seen Zuckerberg, Musk, and Bezos, and I was like, look at there's the Billionaire Boys Club, and I made a video called the Billionaires Boys Club. Get ready for it, and it will be all through the techie, and this is the next move. That which just passed was the setup to give them. It was really a race. And it was a relay race, and Joe said, here, Donald, you're the next to take it to the next level, because they're all in cahoots. We need to know that this has always been, the word government means mind control. They are what their name means. It means mind control. The word government means mind control. Look at etymology. Govern, control, mind, meant. Govern, control, meant mind. Control mind. Mind control. Let me get this.
Vibes. And I'm not super prone to that kind of thinking. So the fact that it hit me like that, I was like, okay, definitely it's good that people are being paranoid. But the intersection feels like it's a very natural intersection to me. So the reason that national security would be fusing with technology is that technology is going to be the front where these battles are fought. And so anybody that's seen, however many thousands of drones that China can launch and get to, dance like a dragon is very compelling when you see it. It looks so cool. And then you imagine, well, what happens when 10,000 drones like that are able to go over aircraft carrier and each one drops a reasonable sized payload that by itself would do next to nothing, but you drop 10,000 of those little somethings on that ship and you turn it into Swiss cheese, you realize, ooh, the way that we've been doing national defense is not going to work in a modern combat scenario. And so it is going to be these tech guys that we're going to need, even if you just grant me that AI is going to get really good at hacking, which there was a recent announcement, I forget if it was from DeepSeek, I can't remember, but there was a company that was doing this where they wanted to see how well their AI was at hacking, and it was unbelievably good. And so they were doing it as a red team inside of a company, so they can say, okay, here's how we broke our own systems. Now we need a blue team that can come in and shore these up. But you're going to have that. Like, if you are living in a world where one country has AI and another does not, the country without it will lose. And so to me, this feels like an arms race we cannot afford to not engage in. And so it
Always
just becomes
keeping
a question
war
of,
going.
all right, well, given the stakes, how do we actually navigate this? So I would not want to pull apart the national security apparatus from the tech bros to be dismissive. So what do you do? I don't know if you want to stay in the lane of like, I just want people looking at the right things, or if you actually have an insight there, but I'd be very curious.
If feet are numb and the sensation won't go away, do this 30-second biblical ritual to relieve nerve pain. Christians, did you know there's a biblical...
I do prefer to stay in my lane as much as possible, frankly, especially on sort of these stickier issues, but I do have some opinions. So first of all, as I referred to earlier with the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and some of these FOIA documents that came out of there, there is the promotion of the idea that essentially the U.S. needs to do what China has done and replicate this civil military fusion model in order to win the AI arms race. And sort of the argument inherent in that is that in order to beat China, we must become China even more than China is. And a lot of the justifications, around China as an adversary are related to how China is not as protective of civil liberties as the United States at least postures itself as being, for example, and a major difference in the value system between China and the United States. And so if you're willing to adopt exactly that model, civil military fusion, in my opinion, is really not that different than fascism at the end of the day. It's the corporatist model, and I don't think it's necessarily what Americans want. And yeah, there is a trade-off, and I think people should consider it. But again, I'm not in the business of telling people what to think. But what happens if we go so far out of a desperation to win an AI arms race with China, for example, that we completely surrender the value system that supposedly makes us a freer, better society in the process? I think that is complicated. And I would also point to the fact that, transnational capital, a lot of that has enabled China's AI arms race. There is a lot of cross-pollination in these, Chinese government adjacent tech corporations. and the United States. You can look at people like Larry Fink, for example, who definitely have a lot of ties to Chinese industry, for example, and people like Steve Schwartzman.
I would say like them, and of course they're not coming from us as like the conscious mindset, more telling you with the factual aspects of what's happened behind the scenes with AI, government, the money, and what's happening that we may not know and have insight, because that's what really I seen her a while ago, and that's what I seen with the money and the Bitcoin. And she was telling the truth. It was left or right. She said they're both bozos. Told the truth on both of them, which I accepted. It wasn't one leaning other side, as we know here, and I keep stressing both sides are the same side. It just the heads and tails of the same nickel. Same bird with two wings. Birds have two wings, left and right. This is the model, right? It's always money, greed, and war. And you know us at Coin, we're done with war. Stop killing folks and murdering folks for you elitists to have your way, and you sacrifice these young men, or even if it's young women now. Come on. Us going to higher space, no, that's Tommy Rhett. We know that this world can go the other way, but we have a lot of sleepyism. And then the control of the programming, right? Like he was saying, that we need this. I'm telling you, the leaders in China are in bed with leaders in America. That's a fact.
Quite similarly, very much tied there, who's head of Blackstone, and they're both very close personal friends of Donald Trump, and also, of course, Fink has ties to the Democrats as well. And a lot of Henry Kissinger, who I mentioned earlier, a lot of top CCP officials have pictures of them with Henry Kissinger in their offices. They love the guy, and there was that effort, of course, to open up China to commerce and partnerships with Western companies, for example, back several decades ago. And a lot of that involved, U.S. capital and some firms like Bechtel, for example, that were very much tied to the national security state of Ronald Reagan, for example. A lot of top people that served in top national security positions under him were involved in Bechtel, which was building a lot of the infrastructure that helped enable China to become the power that it is. And why is that not being talked about? And I mean, this really isn't exclusive to Democrats either, though they often get rightly pointed out for having some conflicts of interest of this nature. But someone like Howard Lutnick, for example, who was head of the transition team for Trump and is his incoming Secretary of Commerce, has the same, his company he runs has the same tie, arguably a more direct tie, to a Chinese government majority-owned financial entity that was a big scandal for conservatives when Hunter Biden's Rosemont Seneca was also tied to it. But there's been no conservative uproar over this tie.
Come on now.
And you have to kind of ask why that may be.
Running game,
and why you
game.
have a lot
That's
of these big tech people, Elon Musk included, who has a major role in the national security state of the United States, is one of the top contractors to Space Force in the Pentagon, for example, and Starlink. And all of these things, through Tesla, has a lot of ties to, Chinese commerce and tech giants that also have rather cozy relationships with the Chinese government as well. Why is that not being discussed as, a potential national security risk if we do really need to become China to beat China? You see what I'm saying? Like, if it was really, that was really the key driver of our issue, shouldn't we be scrutizing the ties of these oligarchs to both China
now
and
we're talking
and our own national security state? And again, I think if people are familiar with my books and my work, there is a scandal that really exposed a lot of this that happened during the Clinton administration and was not properly investigated at all. It's remembered as Chinagate, and it was really sort of,
I remember that.
Today is, I would argue, misremembered as a campaign finance scandal for the Clinton re-election campaign. But what was what was the alleged bribery of the Clinton re-election campaign meant to accomplish? And if you look at what these forces gained, what these figures gained by sort of for all intents and purposes, bribing the Clinton re-election campaign, it was facilitating exports of sensitive national security technology to China. And a lot of that was done through a company called Laurel, which has since become, I think, part of Lockheed Martin. And the guy that ran Laurel at the time, Bernard Schwartz, nothing ever happened to him at all, despite the fact that he helped pass very sensitive satellites and other military technology from the U.S., directly to the Chinese military. And nothing was done about it. And he was actually a major backer of Biden in 2020.
Wow.
Why was that not covered?
Exactly.
Don't you think conservatives should be all over that story?
110.
And, again, that sort of makes me concerned because I think there's not enough talk about transnational capital in these types of situations. And there's a very urgent need to go back and re-examine a lot of the past scandals of our national security state. Chinagate specifically, because as I note in my book, the death of Commerce Secretary Ron Brown and a lot of people at the ITA Department at Commerce, those were the most people targeted as this bribery scandal at Chinagate, because the Commerce Department oversees the export of sensitive technology to foreign powers, right? And the fact that most of the employees that knew about that scandal were all essentially blown up in the same aircraft accident, and that Ron Brown had a bullet hole in his head when his body was discovered in the plane.
Okay.
Why has that not been? Well, it's true. You can look at the evidence, and it's absolutely there. And
they're the same team, man.
Why can't we examine this?
The leader,
and shouldn't it be disturbing that the incoming head of the Commerce Department has a direct tie to the Chinese government in the context of that type of scandal, Chinagate, and targeting the Commerce Department specifically?
Is that Howard Lutnick? Who are we talking about?
Yes.
Want the effects of Viagra, but faster? Wow. Meet Rose Sparks.
This is why I like this woman. She does not pull any punches.
But Sparks
she tells the way it is. He was trying to, because he's looking at it still as, it's wholesome.
Interesting.
No.
Okay, so yet again, Whitney Webb, you lay new things at my feet that I have not yet looked at. I love this. Okay, so what? Yeah, and you do it well. What is your hypothesis on what's going on? Very generous interpretation would be, well, this is globalism. This is people trying to make sure that there are good relations with these incredibly important international players. And we, for decades, tried to make China an ally, open it up so that we could invest there, that they could invest here. And it's only crazy people like me, Tom Bilyeu, who are like, yo, we're in a Cold War with China and this is about to get really weird. What do you think, if that's the naive or overly optimistic view, what do you think is really going on? Is it just personal enrichment? They don't care. Hey, if I'm the Clintons and I have to give China our secrets, but it helps me stay in power, I'm going to do it. We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, let's talk about a reality many business owners are facing. You understand the power of social media, but you're not posting consistently because the editing process can take precious hours.
He was very active, and what he said was sort of smoothing over relationships between East and West during the Cold War. But essentially what he said in testimony to Congress in the early 70s is that there was the rise of what he called the trans-ideological corporation.
I'll go back here.
Precious hours out of your day. Nobody wants to spend hours
of national security state issues between countries when it really doesn't make any sense. An example I like to bring up is a man named Samuel Pisar. You may know him as the stepfather of Anthony Blinken. He was also a prominent lawyer for big tech companies and a lot of other corporations. Also a very good friend and close relation to Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And he was very active. And what he said was sort of smoothing over relationships between East and West during the Cold War. But essentially what he said in testimony to Congress in the early 70s is that there was the rise of what he called the trans-ideological corporation, where you essentially have the multinational corporations, many of them based in the West, making joint ventures with the communist-owned, state-owned enterprises in the East, Russia and China, and that these were essentially fusing to form an economic structure that was unaccountable to any government in the world. And when asked if he thought this development was a good thing, he essentially said, yes, it was, and that was back in the early 1970s, and nothing was really done about it. And you have to kind of ask why Why is that? And it's kind of interesting too for those that subscribe to
Because it's eminence front. It's a put on.
the thesis of someone like Carol Quigley, who wrote many decades ago about this idea of the round table groups and all of that. Sort of coming from Cecil Rhodes and Britain, and efforts to sort of remake the British Empire at a global scale through covert means. They essentially, that thesis essentially argues about creating an unaccountable economic entity as the means to doing that.
No
A blob,
responsibility
if you will.
Switzerland.
That's probably the easiest way to understand it.
Type of Switzerland.
And essentially, I think what we have arrived at as a consequence of that type of, behavior and situation is a situation where we essentially have the nation states acting as enabling environments for policies that are often drafted at the international level by think tanks. And I'm sure the most notorious of those are things like the World Economic Forum, but there's the Council on Foreign Relations, there's Chatham House, there's CSIS. I mean, there's a lot of these entities around. And, oftentimes Congress people aren't really directly writing the policies they're voting on. They're handed laws. And sometimes those are developed from these think tanks, which are funded largely by, multinational corporations, and sometimes, directly by big tech oligarchs like Bill Gates, for example. And those are sort of, shopped not just, in one country, but oftentimes in multiple countries. And so you sort of get multiple countries agreeing to enact the same policy framework for a variety of things. Some people have argued that's why, essentially globally, there was sort of lockstep agreement about what policies to enact in the situation of COVID-19, and also why, ostensible adversaries like Russia, China, the United States, most of the West, all agree about the, sustainable development goals of the United Nations, which if you actually look into the SDGs, a lot of it is about sort of pushing us into this fourth industrial revolution where life becomes increasingly digitized and increasingly surveillable. And
Albert Pike's book,
I would ultimately argue, is about the creation of new markets at the end of the day. And a lot of the push for digital ID is in that. And that's why some have argued that this is sort of a policy that's being implemented globally. And it is true, digital ID in particular, I think the first time most people heard about it might have been COVID-19. But in the post-COVID era, digital ID has made, has been popping up essentially in every country around the world. So has surveillable, programmable, and seizable money, whether in the form of CBDC or its private sector equivalents. And I think it's fair to say that, in countries like United States, where they don't want to have a CBDC, for example, private sector is going to produce it. And they've done that in many occasions to make it sort of, I think, more palatable.
Game on us
a more liberty-minded public. It's not coming from the state; it's coming from the private sector. But ultimately, the end result in the policy is essentially the same. And so, in a sense, yes, I guess some would argue that is globalism in a nutshell. And technocracy, which I mentioned earlier, was an actual movement, and that particular movement built around this organization called Technocracy Inc., which the Canadian branch of which was led by Elon Musk's grandfather. That argued for the creation of all these different unions around the world, these different techniques, like a European Union, an African Union, a North American Union, etc. And that the goal was to sort of push that, some have argued, via the idea of this multipolar world, where you're sort of ending the unipolar model. And I think that's, essentially what has happened, essentially.
I'm going to stop there. We're going to run this. Let's run this commercial and I'll know exactly.
Most people have no clue that in 2024, the best way to make money with Amazon is not with physical products.
Okay, whoa. Let me see if I can boil this down, make sure I understand it.
30 minutes. Stop it now.
Globalism
10 seconds.
is a much bigger move than certainly I would have thought, started much earlier than I would have thought, that has really fused governments together with...
And we'll call that at the 30-minute mark. So if we want to do any more, you guys want to hit me up. I mean, I thought it was very interesting tying Elon Musk's grandfather into this too. which doesn't surprise me. I told you it's all blue blood stuff. They're all connected. Their ancestors are connected. All this is, they've been connected. We can go to Gates and his grandfathers and the Rockefellers. All these are all connected. I mean, I just went through this process of the blue bloods and then the language and then the religion and showing you this is all tied into the system. And now the system's here that many of us heard about, especially coming Christianity, this book of Revelations, they're playing the script out because it's a script. And you see it, but it's all coming through the AI, and the technology is how this is happening. And this has been planned for a long time. I really appreciate this young lady. She really brings it. I will get off at this time. Hit me up. If you guys want to watch the rest, I hit the 30-minute mark pretty much exactly, which leaves about another 51 minutes, I guess, because she was just probably starting to go on because it said Dogecoin, AI, some other things she was going to go on about. So, yeah, I think we need to know. We need to know where to look and what to look. And I've been really decoding AI for a while in everyday life. And I kind of was noticing the discrepancies. It ain't as good as they tell you it is. And I know we get the crumbs off the table, right? We don't get the best thereof. But also know it was lacks soul and lacks sentience. Lacks soul and lacks sentience. If it's programmed, and there's deeper to where this will go, even putting this in your head and your body to read your thoughts. And if you think about committing a crime and it could be just a thought, they can arrest you because you were thinking of doing it when it may have just been a thought and not really a crime. I'm just telling you, and this technology is not perfect, and what we have now is not, and what we're dealing with, and it lacks sentience and it lacks soul. It's artificial. I call it artificial, and I call it alien intelligence. It's not organic. You're the organic ones. Raise your frequency and your vibration up. I mean, time-light splits are maybe what goes all with this. So you guys have a great, wonderful day, okay? And go within. Don't let fear overtake you, because they're pushing the fear model and everything knows you hear. Fear, 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 fear to lower your frequency. So let's not go there. Let's get courage. The other side of fear is courage. And I will do some building more videos. But I just had to do this is, I guess, 3 with her. And if you want to watch the rest of the same video, let me know.